Gildan Media presents Your Coach in a Box, affordable, life-changing audio programs. "50 Psychology Classics" by Tom Butler Bowden, narrated and produced by Lloyd James. Introduction. A journey that spans 50 books, hundreds of ideas, and over a century in time, 50 Psychology Classics looks at some of the most intriguing questions relating to what motivates us, what makes us feel and act in certain ways, how our brains work, and how we create a sense of self. Deeper awareness in these areas can lead us to self-knowledge, a better understanding of human nature, improved relationships, and increased effectiveness. In short, to make a real difference to your life. 50 Psychology Classics explores writings from such iconic figures as Freud, Adler, Jung, Skinner, James, Piaget, and Pavlov, and also highlights the work of contemporary thinkers such as Gardner, Gilbert, Goleman, and Seligman. There is a commentary devoted to each book, revealing the key points and providing a context of the ideas, people, and movements surrounding it. The blend of old and new titles gives you an idea of writings that you should at least know about, even if you are not going to read them, and newer, really practical titles that take account of the latest scientific findings. The focus is on psychology for non-psychologists, books everyone can read and be enlightened by, or that were expressly written for a general audience. In addition to psychologists, the list includes titles by neurologists, psychiatrists, biologists, communications experts, and journalists, not to mention a dock worker, an expert in violence, and a novelist. As the secrets of human behavior are too important to be defined by a single discipline or point of view, we need to hear from such an eclectic collection of voices. The book does not focus primarily on psychiatry, although works by psychiatrists such as Oliver Sacks, Erik Erikson, R.D. Laing, and Viktor Frankl are included, plus some by famous therapists including Carl Rogers, Fritz Perls, and Milton Erickson. 50 Psychology Classics is less about fixes to problems than supplying general insights into why people think or act as they do. Despite the inclusion of some titles relating to the unconscious mind, the emphasis is also not on depth psychology or concepts of the psyche or soul. Some of the best popular writers in this area, including James Hillman, The Soul's Code, Thomas More, Care of the Soul, Carol Pearson, The Hero Within, and Joseph Campbell, The Power of Myth, have been covered in 50 self-help classics and 50 spiritual classics, which explore books on the more transformational and spiritual sides of psychology. The list of 50 psychological classics does not claim to be definitive, just a range over some of the major names and writings. Every collection of this type will be, to some extent, idiosyncratic, and no claims are made to cover the various fields and subfields in psychology comprehensively. Here, we are seeking basic insights into some of the most intriguing psychological questions and concepts, and a greater knowledge of human nature. The rise of a science. Psychology is the science of mental life. William James. As the early memory researcher Hermann Ebbinghaus, 1850 to 1909, wrote, "Psychology has a long past, but only a short history." He meant that people have been thinking about human thought, emotion, intelligence, and behavior for thousands of years. But as a discipline based on facts, rather than speculation, psychology is still in its infancy. Even though he made his statement 100 years ago, psychology is still considered young. It emerged from two other disciplines, physiology and philosophy. German Wilhelm Wundt, 1832 to 1920, is seen as the father of psychology because he insisted it should be a separate discipline, more empirical than philosophy, and more focused on the mind than physiology. In the 1870s, he created the first experimental psychological laboratory and wrote his huge work, Principles of Psychological Psychology. As Wundt is read today only by those with a specialized interest, he is not included in the list of classics. American philosopher William James, 1842 to 1910, however, also considered a founding father of modern psychology, is still widely read. The brother of novelist Henry James, he trained in medicine and then transferred to philosophy, but like Wundt, felt that the workings of the mind deserved to be a separate field of study. Building on a theory by German neuroanatomist Franz Gall that all thoughts and mental processes were biological, James helped to spread the remarkable idea that one's self, with all its hopes, loves, desires, and fears, was contained in the soft gray matter within the walls of the skull. Explanations of thought as the product of some deeper force, such as the soul, he felt, were really the realm of metaphysics. James may have helped define the parameters of psychology, but it was Sigmund Freud's writings that really made it a subject of interest to the general public. Freud was born 150 years ago, in 1856. His parents knew he was bright, but even they could not have imagined the impact his ideas would have on the world. On leaving school, he was set to study law, but changed his mind at the last minute and enrolled in medicine. His work on brain anatomy and with patients suffering from hysteria led him to wonder about the influence of the unconscious mind on behavior, which sparked his interest in dreams. Today, it is easy to take for granted how much the average person is familiar with psychological concepts, such as the ego and the unconscious mind. But these and many others are all, for better or worse, Freud's legacy. Well over half the titles covered in 50 psychology classics are either by Freudians or post-Freudians, or mark themselves out by being anti-Freud. It is now fashionable to say that Freud's work is unscientific, and his writings literary creations rather than real psychology. Whether this is accurate or not, he remains far and away the most famous person in the field. And although psychoanalysis, the talking therapy he created to peep into a person's unconscious, is now much less practiced, the image of a Viennese doctor drawing out the deepest thoughts of his couch-lying patient is still the most popular image we have when thinking of psychology. As some neuroscientists have intimated, Freud may be due for a comeback. His emphasis on the major role of the unconscious in shaping behavior has not been proved wrong by brain imaging techniques and other research, and some of his other theories may yet be validated. Even if not, his position as psychology's most original thinker is not likely to change. The reaction to Freud came most obviously in the form of behaviorism. Ivan Pavlov's famous experiments with dogs, which showed that animals were simply the sum of their conditioned responses to environmental stimuli, inspired behaviorism's leading exponent, B.F. Skinner, who wrote that the idea of the autonomous person driven by an inner motive was a romantic myth. Instead of trying to find out what goes on inside a person's head, mentalism, to know why people act as they do, Skinner suggested all we need to know is what circumstances cause them to act in a certain way. Our environments shape us into what we are, and we change the course of our actions according to what we learn is good for our survival. If we want to construct a better world, we need to create environments that make people act in more moral or productive ways. To Skinner, this involved a technology of behavior that rewards certain actions and not others. Emerging in the 1960s, cognitive psychology used the same rigorous scientific approach as behaviorism, but returned to the question of how behavior is actually generated inside the head. Between the stimulation received from the environment and our response, certain processes had to occur inside the brain. And cognitive researchers revealed the human mind to be a great interpreting machine that made patterns and created sense of the world outside, forming maps of reality. This work led cognitive therapists such as Aaron Beck, David D. Burns, and Albert Ellis to build treatment around the idea that our thoughts shape our emotions, not the other way around. By changing our thinking, we can alleviate depression or simply have greater control over our behavior. This form of psychotherapy has now largely taken the place that Freudian psychoanalysis once assumed in treating people's mental issues. A more recent development in the cognitive field is positive psychology, which has sought to reorient the discipline away from mental problems to the study of what makes people happy, optimistic, and productive. To some extent, this area was foreshadowed by pioneering humanistic psychologist Abraham Maslow, who wrote about the self-actualized or fulfilled person, and Carl Rogers, who once noted that he was pessimistic about the world, but optimistic about people. In the last 30 years, both behavioral and cognitive psychology have been increasingly informed by advances in brain science. The behaviorists thought it wrong to merely surmise what happened inside the brain, but science is now allowing us to see inside and map the neural pathways and synapses that actually generate action. This research may end up revolutionizing how we see ourselves, almost certainly for the better, because while some people fear that the reduction of human beings to how the brain is wired will dehumanize us, in fact, greater knowledge of the brain can only increase our appreciation of its workings. Today's sciences of the brain are enabling us to return to William James's definition of psychology as the science of mental life, except that this time we are able to advance knowledge based on what we know at the molecular level. Having evolved partly out of the field of physiology, psychology may be returning to its physical roots. The irony is that this attention to minute physicality is yielding answers to some of our deepest philosophical questions, such as the nature of consciousness, free will, the creation of memory, and the experience and control of emotion. It may even be that the mind and the self are simply illusions created by the extraordinary complexity of the brain's neural wiring and chemical reactions. What is the future of psychology? Perhaps all we can be certain of is that it will become a science more and more based on knowledge of the brain. A quick guide to the literature. Part of the reason psychology became a popular field of study is that its early titans, including James, Freud, Jung, and Adler, wrote books that ordinary people could understand. We can pick up one of their titles today and still be entranced. Despite the difficulty of some of the concepts, people have a deep hunger for knowledge on how the mind works, human motivation, and behavior. And in the last 15 years, there has been something of a new golden age in popular psychology writing, with authors such as Daniel Goleman, Steven Pinker, Martin Seligman, and Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi filling the need. Now I'll cover a brief introduction to the titles covered in 50 psychology classics. The books are divided into 7 categories that, although unconventional, may help you to choose titles according to the themes that interest you most. Behavior, Biology, and Genes, A Science of the Brain. Lou Ann Brizendine, The Female Brain. William James, The Principles of Psychology. Alfred Kinsey, Sexual Behavior in the Human Female. Anne Mois and David Jessel, Brain Sex. Jean Piaget, The Language and Thought of the Child. Steven Pinker, The Blank Slate. V.S. Ramachandran, Phantoms in the Brain. And Oliver Sacks, The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat. For William James, psychology was a natural science based on the workings of the brain. But in his era, the tools to study this mysterious organ properly were not adequate to the task. Now, with technological advances, psychology is gaining many of its insights from the brain itself, rather than from the behavior it generates. This new emphasis on brain science raises uncomfortable questions regarding the biological and genetic bases of behavior. Is the way we are relatively unchangeable, or are we a blank slate, ready to be socialized by our environments. The old debate over nature versus nurture has gained new energy. Genetic science and evolutionary psychology have demonstrated that much of what we call human nature, including intelligence and personality, is wired into us in the womb, or at least hormonally influenced. For cultural or political reasons, Steven Pinker notes in The Blank Slate, the major role that biology plays in human behavior is sometimes denied. But as knowledge increases, this will become increasingly difficult to maintain. Luann Brisendine's book, for example, the result of many years' study of the effects that hormones have on the female brain, brilliantly shows the extent to which women can be shaped by their biology at different stages in life. More fundamentally, Moi and Jessel's brain sex presents a convincing case that many of our behavioral tendencies come from the sexual biology of our brains, which are largely set by the time the fetus is 8 weeks old. Even our cherished ideas about the self are going under the microscope. Today's neuroscience suggests that the self is best understood as a sort of illusion that the brain creates. The remarkable writings of Oliver Sacks, for instance, show that the brain continually works to create and maintain the feeling of an I that is in control, even if there is in fact no part of the brain that can be identified as the locus of self-feeling. Neuroscientist V.S. Ramachandran's work with phantom limbs seems to confirm the brain's remarkable ability to create a sense of cognitive unity, even if the reality of many cells and of many layers of consciousness is more complex. Jean Piaget never did any laboratory work on the brain, but grew up studying snails in the Swiss mountains. He applied an early genius for scientific observation to the study of children, noting that they progress along a definite line of stages according to age, assuming there is adequate stimulation from their environments. Equally, sex researcher Alfred Kinsey, also originally a biologist, sought to shatter the taboo surrounding male and female sexuality by pointing out how our mammalian biology drives our sexual behaviors. The work of both Piaget and Kinsey suggests that while biology is always a dominant influence on behavior, environment is critical to its expression. Even amid the new findings on the genetic or biological basis of behavior, we should never conclude that as human beings, we are determined by our DNA, hormones, or brain structure. Unlike other animals, we are aware of our instincts, and as a result may attempt to shape or control them. We are neither nature nor nurture only, but an interesting combination of both. Tapping the unconscious mind. Wisdom of a different kind. Gavin de Becker, The Gift of Fear. Milton Erickson by Sidney Rosen. My Voice Will Go With You. Sigmund Freud, The Interpretation of Dreams. Malcolm Gladwell, Blink. And Carl Jung, The Archetypes and the Collective Unconscious. Psychology involves more than the rational thinking mind, and our ability to tap into our unconscious can yield a vast store of wisdom. Freud tried to show that dreams are not simply meaningless hallucinations, but a window into the unconscious that can reveal suppressed wishes. To him, the conscious mind was like the tip of an iceberg, with the submerged bulk providing the center of gravity in terms of motivation. Jung went further, identifying a whole sub-rational architecture, the collective unconscious, that exists independent of particular individuals, constantly generating the customs, art, mythology, and literature of culture. For both Jung and Freud, greater awareness of what lies beneath meant someone was less likely to be tripped up by life. The unconscious was a store of intelligence and wisdom that could be accessed if we knew how, and their great task was to reconnect us to our deeper selves. As therapy, depth psychology has been no more than moderately successful, and tends to be only as effective as the insights or techniques of particular practitioners. Milton Erickson, for example, a famous hypnotherapist, had the motto, "It is really amazing what people can do." only they don't know what they can do. He also understood the unconscious to be a well of wise solutions, and enabled his patients to tap into it and regain forgotten personal power. As a bridge between the conscious and the unconscious, intuition is a form of wisdom that we can cultivate. This is chillingly demonstrated in Gavin de Becker's The Gift of Fear, which provides many examples of our natural ability to know what to do in critical life or death situations, as long as we are prepared to listen to and act on our internal voice. Malcolm Gladwell's Blink also highlights the power of thinking without thinking, showing that an instant assessment of a situation or person is often as accurate as one formed over a long period. While obviously logic and rationality are important, smart people are in touch with all levels of their mind and trustful of their feelings, even when the origins of those feelings seem mysterious. Thinking better, feeling better. Happiness and mental health. Nathaniel Branden, The Psychology of Self-Esteem. David D. Burns, Feeling Good. Albert Ellis and Robert Harper, A Guide to Rational Living. Daniel Gilbert, Stumbling on Happiness. Fritz Perls, Gestalt Therapy. Barry Schwartz, The Paradox of Choice. Martin Seligman, Authentic Happiness. William Styron, Darkness Visible. And Robert E. Thayer, The Origin of Everyday Moods. For many years, psychology was surprisingly little interested in happiness. Martin Seligman has helped to raise the subject to serious study and observation, and his positive psychology is revealing through science the sometimes unexpected recipes for mental well-being. Barry Schwartz's distinction between maximizers and satisfiers has given us the counterintuitive insight that restricting our choices in life can actually lead to greater happiness and satisfaction. And Daniel Gilbert's book points out the surprising fact that although humans are the only animals who can look into the future, we often make mistakes in terms of what we think will lead to happiness. Turning from the macro to the micro, Robert Thayer's work into the psychological causes of daily moods has helped thousands of people gain better control over how they feel hour by hour. The fascinating insights of each of these books shows that the achievement of happiness is never as simple a matter as we would like. The cognitive psychology revolution has had a dramatic impact on mental health, and two of its major names are David D. Burns and Albert Ellis. Their mantra that thoughts create feelings, not the other way around, has helped many people get back in control of their lives because it applies logic and reason to the murky pool of emotions. Yet their work has many implications for achieving happiness generally, in that most of us can literally choose to be happy if we understand the mind's thought-emotion mechanism. The concept of self-esteem has been criticized in recent years, but Nathaniel Branden's seminal work on the subject remains convincing in its argument that personal esteem arises from having our own set of principles and acting on them. When we fail to do this, it is easy to descend into self-hatred and depression. Yet as William Styron's classic account of his own battle with depression indicates, the causes of the condition are often mysterious and can strike anyone. He notes that it remains the cancer of the mental health world. We are close to finding a cure, but not close enough for those who do not respond quickly to drugs or therapy. Why we are, how we are. The study of personality and the self. Isabel Briggs Myers, Gifts Differing. Eric Erikson, Young Man Luther. Hans Eysenck, Dimensions of Personality. Anna Freud, The Ego and the Mechanisms of Defense. Karen Horney, Our Inner Conflicts. Melanie Klein, Envy and Gratitude. Artie Lang, The Divided Self. And Gail Sheehy, Passages. The ancients commanded us to know thyself, but in psychology this quest takes on many aspects. Eysenck's work on the extroverted and neurotic dimensions of personality paved the way for many other models, with contemporary psychologists commonly assessing people according to the big five personality traits of extroversion, agreeableness, conscientiousness, neuroticism, and openness to experience. Today, we can take myriad tests to determine our personality type, and while it is wise to be skeptical of their validity, some can provide genuine insights. The best known of the modern forms is the inventory originally created by Isabel Briggs Myers. Of course, who we are at one point in our life may be different from who we are at another. Erik Erikson coined the term identity crisis, and in his compelling psychobiography of religious reformer Martin Luther, he conveys both the pain of uncertain identity and the power that comes when we finally know who we are. As Gail Sheehy pointed out in her 1970s hit, Passages, we go through many crises during adult life, and not only are they somewhat predictable, we should welcome them as an opportunity for growth. Human beings sometimes have to cope with what seem like competing selves. Anna Freud took up where her father left off in focusing on the psychology of the ego, noting that humans do just about anything to avoid pain and preserve a sense of self, and this compulsion often results in the creation of psychological defenses. Neo-Freudian Karen Horney believed that childhood experiences resulted in our creation of a self that moved toward people or moved away from people. These tendencies were a sort of mask that could develop into neuroses if we were not willing to move beyond them. Underneath was what she called a wholehearted or real person. Melanie Klein focused on how a schizoid personality could develop as a result of an infant's relations with its mother in the first year of life, although she noted that most people grow out of this and establish healthy relations with themselves and the world. Most of us do have a strong sense of self, but as R.D. Laing showed in his landmark work on schizophrenia, some people lack this basic security and attempt to replace the vacuum with false selves. Most of the time we take it for granted, but it is only when it is lost that we can fully appreciate our brain's ability to create the feeling of self-possession or be comfortable with who we are. Why we do what we do. Great thinkers on human motivation. Alfred Adler, Understanding Human Nature. Viktor Frankl, The Will to Meaning. Eric Hoffer, The True Believer. Abraham Maslow, The Farther Reaches of Human Nature. Stanley Milgram, Obedience to Authority. Ivan Pavlov, Conditioned Reflexes. And B.F. Skinner, Beyond Freedom and Dignity. Alfred Adler was a member of Freud's original inner circle, but broke away because he disagreed that sex was the prime mover behind human behavior. He was more interested in how our early environments shape us, believing that we all seek greater power by trying to make up for what we perceive we lacked in childhood, his famous theory of compensation. If Adler's theory of human action relates to power, concentration camp survivor Viktor Frankl's brand of existential psychology, logotherapy, posits that the human species is uniquely made to seek meaning. It is our responsibility to look for meaning in life, even in the darkest times, and whatever the circumstances, we always have a vestige of free will. Yet, as amateur psychologist Eric Hoffer wrote in The True Believer, people allow themselves to be swept up in larger causes in order to be freed of responsibility for their lives, and to escape the banality and misery of the present. And Stanley Milgram's famous experiments showed that, given the right conditions, human beings exhibit a frightening willingness to put others through pain in order to be seen kindly by those in authority. Humanistic psychologist Abraham Maslow, on the other hand, identified a minority of self-actualized individuals who did not act simply out of conformity to society, but chose their own path and lived to fulfill their potential. This type of person was a representative of human nature as any mindless conformist. While poets, writers, and philosophers have long celebrated the inner motive that guides autonomous human behavior, B.F. Skinner defined the self simply as a repertoire of behavior appropriate to a given set of contingencies. There was no such thing as human nature, and conscience or morality could be boiled down to environments that induced us to behave in moral ways. Skinner's ideas built on the work of Ivan Pavlov, whose success in conditioning dogs' behavior also brought into question the freedom of human action. Despite these vast differences in understanding motivation, together these books provide remarkable insights into why we do what we do, or at least what we are capable of doing, both good and bad. Why we love the way we do. The dynamics of relationships. Eric Berne, Games People Play. Susan Forward, Emotional Blackmail. John M. Gottman, The 7 Principles for Making Marriage Work. Harry Harlow, The Nature of Love. Thomas A. Harris, I'm Okay, You're Okay. And Carl Rogers, On Becoming a Person. Love has traditionally been the domain of poets, artists, and philosophers. But in the last 50 years, the terrain of relationships has increasingly been mapped by psychologists. In the 1950s, primate researcher Harry Harlow's legendary experiments, replacing the real mothers of baby monkeys with cloth ones, proved the extent to which infants need loving physical attention in order to become healthy adults. Remarkably, this sort of touching went against the child-rearing views of the time. More recently, marriage researcher John M. Gottman looked at another aspect of relationship dynamics and found that the conventional wisdom on what makes long-term romantic partnerships work is often wrong. The most valuable information on how to maintain or save relationships comes from scientific observation of couples in action, right down to the micro-expressions and apparently inane comments seen in everyday conversations. Similarly, in the past we may have looked to literature to be enlightened about a subject as intensely personal as emotional blackmail. But psychologists, such as Susan Forward, are now providing better answers on how we can protect ourselves against this corrosive element in relationships. Pop psychology pioneers Eric Berne and Thomas Harris understood our close personal encounters as transactions that could be analyzed according to the 3 selves of adult, child, and parent. Berne's observation that we are always playing games with each other is perhaps a cynical view of humanity. But by becoming aware of those games, we have the chance to move beyond them. The contribution of humanistic psychology to better relationships is recognized by the inclusion of Carl Rogers, whose influential book reminds us that relationships cannot flower if they don't have a climate of listening and non-judgmental acceptance, and that empathy is the mark of a genuine person. Working at our peak, creative power and communication skills. Robert Bolton, People Skills. Edward de Bono, Lateral Thinking. Robert Cialdini, Influence. Mahali Csikszentmihalyi.
To Victoria O. In his A History of the World War, page 212, Captain Liddell Hart reports that a planned offensive by 13 British divisions, supported by 1,400 artillery pieces, against the German line at Sermontoben, scheduled for July 24, 1916, had to be postponed till the morning of the 29th. He comments that torrential rain caused this delay, which lacked any special significance. The following deposition, dictated by, read over, and then signed by Dr. Yutsun, former teacher of English at the Tsingtao Hochschule, cast unsuspected light upon this event. The first 2 pages are missing. Asterisk, and I hung up the phone. Immediately I recollected the voice that had spoken in German. It was that of Captain Richard Madden. Madden, Victor Runeberg's office, meant the end of all our work, and, though this seemed a secondary matter, or should have seemed so to me, of our lives also. His being there meant that Runeberg had been arrested or murdered. Before the sun set on this same day, I ran the same risk. Madden was implacable. Rather, to be more accurate, he was obliged to be implacable. An Irishman in the service of England, a man suspected of equivocal feelings, if not of actual treachery, how could he fail to welcome and seize upon this extraordinary piece of luck? The discovery, capture, and perhaps the deaths of 2 agents of Imperial Germany? I went up to my bedroom. Absurd though the gesture was, I closed and locked the door. I threw myself down on my narrow iron bed, and waited on my back. The never-changing rooftops filled the window, and the hazy 6 o'clock sun hung in the sky. It seemed incredible that this day, a day without warnings or omens, might be that of my implacable death. In despite of my dead father, in despite of having been a child in one of the symmetrical gardens of Haifeng, was I to die now? Then I reflected that all things happen to one, precisely now. Century follows century, and things happen only in the present. There are countless men in the air, on land and at sea, and all that really happens to me. The almost unbearable memory of Madden's long horse face put an end to these wandering thoughts. In the midst of my hatred and terror, now that it no longer matters to me to speak of terror, now that I have outwitted Richard Madden, now that my neck hankers for the hangman's noose, I knew that the fast-moving and doubtless happy soldier did not suspect that I possessed the secret, the name of the exact site of the new British artillery park on the Anchor. A bird streaked across the misty sky and, absently, I turned it into an airplane and then that airplane into many in the skies of France, shattering the artillery park under a rain of bombs. If only my mouth, before it should be silenced by a bullet, could shout this name in such a way that it could be heard in Germany, my voice, my human voice, was weak. How could it reach the ear of the chief? The ear of that sick and hateful man who knew nothing of Runeberg or of me except that we were in Staffordshire. A man who, sitting in his arid Berlin office, leafed infinitely through newspapers, looking in vain for news from us. I said aloud, I must flee. I sat up on the bed, in senseless and perfect silence, as if Madden was already peering at me. Something, perhaps merely a desire to prove my total penury to myself, made me empty out my pockets. I found just what I knew I was going to find. The American watch, the nickel-plated chain and the square coin, the key ring with the useless but compromising keys to Runeberg's office, the notebook, a letter which I decided to destroy at once, and which I did not destroy, a 5-shilling piece, 2 single shillings and some pennies, a red and blue pencil, a handkerchief, and a revolver with a single bullet. Absurdly I held it and weighed it in my hand, to give myself courage. Vaguely I thought that a pistol shot can be heard for a great distance. In 10 minutes I had developed my plan. The telephone directory gave me the name of the one person capable of passing on the information. He lived in a suburb of Fenton, less than half an hour away by train. I am a timorous man. I can say it now that I have brought my incredibly risky plan to an end. It was not easy to bring about, and I know that its execution was terrible. I did not do it for Germany, no. Such a barbarous country is of no importance to me, particularly since it had degraded me by making me become a spy. Furthermore, I knew an Englishman, a modest man, who, for me, is as great as Goethe. I did not speak with him for more than an hour, but during that time, he was Goethe. I carried out my plan because I felt the chief had some fear of those of my race, of those uncountable forebears whose culmination lies in me. I wished to prove to him that a yellow man could save his armies. Besides, I had to escape the captain. His hands and voice could, at any moment, knock and beckon at my door. Silently, I dressed, took leave of myself in the mirror, went down the stairs, sneaked a look at the quiet street, and went out. The station was not far from my house, but I thought it more prudent to take a cab. I told myself that I thus ran less chance of being recognized. The truth is that, in the deserted street, I felt infinitely visible and vulnerable. I recall that I told the driver to stop short of the main entrance. I got out with a painful and deliberate slowness. I was going to the village of Ashgrove, but took a ticket for a station further on. The train would leave in a few minutes, at 8:50. I hurried, for the next would not go until 9:30. There was almost no one on the platform. I walked through the carriages. I remember some farmers, a woman dressed in mourning, a youth deep in Tacitus annals, and a wounded, happy soldier. At last the train pulled out. A man I recognized ran furiously, but vainly, the length of the platform. It was Captain Richard Madden. Shattered, trembling, I huddled in the distant corner of the seat, as far as possible from the fearful window. From utter terror, I passed into a state of almost abject happiness. I told myself that the duel had already started and that I had won the first encounter by besting my adversary in his first attack, even if it was only for 40 minutes, by an accident of fate. I argued that so small a victory prefigured a total victory. I argued that it was not so trivial, that were it not for the precious accident of the train schedule, I would be in prison or dead. I argued, with no less sophism, that my timorous happiness was proof that I was man enough to bring this adventure to a successful conclusion. From my weakness I drew strength that never left me. I foresee that man will resign himself each day to new abominations, that soon only soldiers and bandits will be left. To them I offer this advice. Whosoever would undertake some atrocious enterprise should act as if it were already accomplished, should impose upon himself a future as irrevocable as the past. Thus I proceeded, while with the eyes of a man already dead, I contemplated the fluctuations of the day, which would probably be my last, and watched the diffuse coming of night. The train crept along gently, amid ash trees. It slowed down and stopped, almost in the middle of a field. No one called the name of a station. Ash Grove? I asked some children on the platform. Ash Grove, they replied. I got out. A lamp lit the platform, but the children's faces remained in a shadow. One of them asked me, "Are you going to Dr. Stephen Albert's house?" Without waiting for my answer, another said, "The house is a good distance away, but you won't get lost if you take the road to the left and bear to the left at every crossroad." I threw them a coin. My last went down some stone steps and started along a deserted road. At a slight incline, the road ran downhill. It was a plain dirt way, and overhead the branches of trees intermingled, while a round moon hung low in the sky as if to keep me company. For a moment I thought that Richard Madden might in some way have divined my desperate intent. At once I realized that this would be impossible. The advice about turning always to the left reminded me that such was the common formula for finding the central courtyard of certain labyrinths. I know something about labyrinths. Not for nothing am I the great-grandson of T.S. Whippen. He was governor of Yunnan and gave up temporal power to write a novel with more characters than there are in the Hung Meng, and to create a maze in which all men would lose themselves. He spent 13 years on these oddly assorted tasks before he was assassinated by a stranger. His novel had no sense to it, and nobody ever found his labyrinth. Under the trees of England, I meditated on this lost and perhaps mythical labyrinth. I imagined it untouched and perfect on the secret summit of some mountain. I imagined it drowned under rice paddies or beneath the sea. I imagined it infinite, made not only of eight-sided pavilions and of twisting paths, but also of rivers, provinces, and kingdoms. I thought of a maze of mazes, of a sinuous, ever-growing maze which would take in both past and future and would somehow involve the stars. Lost in these imaginary illusions, I forgot my destiny, that of the hunted. For an undetermined period of time, I felt myself cut off from the world, an abstract spectator. The hazy and murmuring countryside, the moon, the decline of the evening, stirred within me. Going down the gently sloping road, I could not feel fatigue. The evening was at once intimate and infinite. The road kept descending and branching off, through meadows misty in the twilight. A high-pitched and almost syllabic music kept coming and going, moving with the breeze, blurred by the leaves and by distance. I thought that a man might be an enemy of other men, of the differing moments of other men, but never an enemy of a country. Not of fireflies, words, gardens, streams, or the west wind. Meditating thus, I arrived at a high, rusty iron gate. Through the railings I could see an avenue bordered with poplar trees and also a kind of summer house or pavilion. Two things dawned on me at once, the first trivial and the second almost incredible. The music came from that pavilion, and that music was Chinese. That was why I had accepted it fully, without paying it any attention. I do not remember whether there was a bell, a push button, or whether I attracted attention by clapping my hands. The stuttering sparks of the music kept on. But from the end of the avenue, from the main house, a lantern approached, a lantern which alternately, from moment to moment, was crisscrossed or put out by the trunks of the trees, a paper lantern shaped like a drum and colored like the moon. A tall man carried it. I could not see his face, for the light blinded me. He opened the gate and spoke slowly in my language. I see that the worthy Shiping has troubled himself to see to relieving my solitude. No doubt you want to see the garden? Recognizing the name of one of our consuls, I replied, somewhat taken aback. The garden? The garden of forking paths. Something stirred in my memory, and I said, with incomprehensible assurance, the garden of my ancestor, T.S. Whippen. Your ancestor? Your illustrious ancestor? Come in. The damp path zigzagged like those of my childhood. When we reached the house, we went into a library filled with books from both east and west. I recognized some large volumes bound in yellow silk manuscripts of a lost encyclopedia which was edited by the third emperor of the Luminous dynasty. They had never been printed. A phonograph record was spinning near a bronze phoenix. I remember also a rose-glazed jar and yet another, older by many centuries, of that blue color which our potters copied from the Persians. Stephen Albert was watching me with a smile on his face. He was, as I have said, remarkably tall. His face was deeply lined, and he had gray eyes and a gray beard. There was about him something of the priest, and something of the sailor. Later, he told me he had been a missionary in Tientsin before he had aspired to become a sinologist. We sat down, I upon a large, low divan, he with his back to the window and to a large circular clock. I calculated that my pursuer, Richard Madden, could not arrive in less than an hour. My irrevocable decision could wait. A strange destiny, said Stephen Albert, that of T.S. Whippen, governor of his native province, learned in astronomy, in astrology and tireless in the interpretation of the canonical books, a chess player, a famous poet and a calligrapher. Yet he abandoned all to make a book and a labyrinth. He gave up all the pleasures of oppression, justice, of a well-stocked bed, of banquets, and even of erudition, and shut himself up in the pavilion of the limpid sun for 13 years. At his death, his heirs found only a mess of manuscripts. The family, as you doubtless know, wished to consign them to the fire, but the executor of the estate, a Taoist or a Buddhist monk, insisted on their publication. "Those are the blood of T.S. Pen," I replied, "still curse the memory of that monk. Such a publication was madness. The book is a shapeless mass of contradictory rough drafts. I examined it once upon a time. The hero dies in the 3rd chapter, while in the 4th he is alive. As for that other enterprise of T.S. Pen, his labyrinth." "Here is the labyrinth," Albert said, pointing to a tall, lacquered writing cabinet. "An ivory labyrinth?" I exclaimed. "A tiny labyrinth indeed." "A symbolic labyrinth," he corrected me. "An invisible labyrinth of time. I, a barbarous Englishman, have been given the key to this transparent mystery. After more than 100 years, most of the details are irrecoverable, lost beyond all recall, but it isn't hard to image what must have happened. At one time, T.S. Pen must have said, 'I am going into seclusion to write a book,' and at another, 'I am retiring to construct a maze.' Everyone assumed these were separate activities. No one realized that the book and the labyrinth were one and the same. The pavilion of the limpid sun was set in the middle of an intricate garden. This may have suggested the idea of a physical maze. T.S. Pen died. In all the vast lands which once belonged to your family, no one could find the labyrinth. The novel's confusion suggested that it was the labyrinth. 2 circumstances showed me the direct solution to the problem. First, the curious legend that T.S. Pen had proposed to create an infinite maze. Second, a fragment of a letter which I discovered." Albert rose. For a few moments he turned his back to me. He opened the top drawer in the high black and gilded writing cabinet. He returned holding in his hand a piece of paper which had once been crimson, but which had faded with the passage of time. It was rose-colored, tenuous, quadrangular. T.S. Pen's calligraphy was justly famous. Eagerly, but without understanding, I read the words which a man of my own blood had written with a small brush. "I leave to various future times, but not to all, my garden of forking paths." I handed back the sheet of paper in silence. Albert went on. "Before I discovered this letter, I kept asking myself how a book could be infinite. I could not imagine any other than a cyclic volume, circular. A volume whose last page would be the same as the first and so have the possibility of continuing indefinitely. I recalled, too, the night in the middle of the 1001 Nights when Queen Scheherazade, through a magical mistake on the part of her copyist, started to tell the story of the 1001 Nights, with the risk of again arriving at the night upon which she will relate it, and thus on to infinity. I also imagined a Platonic hereditary work, passed on from father to son, to which each individual would add a new chapter or correct, with pious care, the work of his elders. These conjectures gave me amusement, but none seemed to have the remotest application to the contradictory chapters of T.S. Pen. At this point, I was sent from Oxford the manuscript you have just seen. Naturally, my attention was caught by the sentence, "I leave to various future times, but not to all, my garden of forking paths." I had no sooner read this than I understood. The garden of forking paths was the chaotic novel itself. The phrase "to various future times, but not to all" suggested the image of bifurcating in time, not in space. Rereading the whole work confirmed this theory. In all fiction, when a man is faced with alternatives, he chooses one at the expense of the others. In the almost unfathomable T.S. Pen, he chooses, simultaneously, all of them. He thus creates various futures, various times which start others that will in their turn branch out and bifurcate in other times. This is the cause of the contradictions in the novel. Fang, let us say, has a secret. A stranger knocks at his door. Fang makes up his mind to kill him. Naturally, there are various possible outcomes. Fang can kill the intruder can kill Fang, both can be saved, both can die, and so on and so on. In T.S. Whipan's work, all the possible solutions occur, each one being the point of departure for other bifurcations. Sometimes the pathways of this labyrinth converge. For example, you come to this house, but in other possible pasts you are my enemy, in others my friend. If you will put up with my atrocious pronunciation, I would like to read you a few pages of your ancestor's work. His countenance, in the bright circle of lamplight, was certainly that of an ancient, but it shone with something unyielding, even immortal. With slow precision, he read two versions of the same epic chapter. In the first, an army marches into battle over a desolate mountain pass. The bleak and somber aspect of the rocky landscape made the soldiers feel that life itself was of little value, and so they won the battle easily. In the second, the same army passes through a palace where a banquet is in progress. The splendor of the feast remained a memory throughout the glorious battle, and so victory followed. With proper veneration, I listened to these old tales, although perhaps with less admiration for them in themselves than for the fact that they had been fought out by one of my own blood, and that a man of a distant empire had given them back to me, in the last stage of a desperate adventure, on a western island. I remember the final words, repeated at the end of each version like a secret command. Thus the heroes fought, with tranquil heart and bloody sword. They were resigned to killing and to dying. At that moment I felt within me and around me something invisible and intangible pullulating. It was not the pullulation of two divergent, parallel, and finally converging armies, but an agitation more inaccessible, more intimate, prefigured by them in some way. Stephen Albert continued, I do not think that illustrious ancestor toyed idly with variations. Waste 13, laboring over a never-ending experiment in rhetoric. In your country, the novel is an inferior genre. In T.S. Whipan's period, it was a despised one. And was a fine novelist, but he was also a man of letters who, doubtless, considered himself more than a mere novelist. The testimony of his contemporaries attests this, and certainly the known facts of his life confirm his leanings toward the metaphysical and the mystical. Philosophical conjectures take up the greater part of his novel. I know that of all problems, none disquieted him more, and none concerned him more than the profound one of time. Now then, this is the only problem that does not figure in the pages of the garden. He does not even use the word which means time. How can these voluntary omissions be explained? I proposed various solutions, all of them inadequate. We discussed them. Finally Stephen Albert said, in a guessing game to which the answer is chess, which word is the only one prohibited? I thought for a moment and then replied, the word is chess. Precisely, said Albert. The Garden of Forking Paths is an enormous guessing game, or parable, in which the subject is time. The rules of the game forbid the use of the word itself. To eliminate the word completely, to refer to it by means of inept phrases and obvious paraphrases, is perhaps the best way of drawing attention to it. This, then, is the tortuous method of approach preferred by the oblique T.S. Whipan in every meandering of his interminable novel. I have gone over hundreds of manuscripts, I have corrected errors introduced by careless copyists, I have worked out the plan from this chaos, I have restored, or believe I have restored, the original. I have translated the whole work. I can state categorically that not once has the word time been used in the whole book. The explanation is obvious. The Garden of Forking Paths is a picture, incomplete yet not false, of the universe such as P.S. Witten conceived it to be. Differing from Newton and Schopenhauer, your ancestor did not think of time as absolute and uniform. He believed in an infinite series of times, in a dizzily growing, ever-spreading network of diverging, converging and parallel times. This web of time, the strands of which approach one another, bifurcate, intersect or ignore each other through the centuries, embraces every possibility. We do not exist in most of them. In some you exist and not I, while in others I do, and you do not, and in yet others, both of us exist. In this one, in which chance has favored me, you have come to my gate. In another, you, crossing the garden, have found me dead. In yet another, I say these very same words, but am in error, a phantom. In all of them, I enunciated, with a tremor in my voice, I deeply appreciate and am grateful to you for the restoration of T.S. Witten's garden. Not in all, he murmured with a smile. Time is forever dividing itself toward innumerable futures, and in one of them I am your enemy. Once again I sensed the pullulation of which I have already spoken. It seemed to me that the dew-damp garden surrounding the house was infinitely saturated with invisible people. All were Albert and myself, secretive, busy and multiform in other dimensions of time. I lifted my eyes and the short nightmare disappeared. In the black and yellow garden, there was only a single man, but this man was as strong as a statue, and this man was walking up the path, and he was Captain Richard Madden. The future exists now, I replied, but I am your friend. Can I take another look at the letter? Albert rose from his seat. He stood up tall as he opened the top drawer of the high writing cabinet. For a moment his back was again turned to me. I had the revolver ready. I fired with the utmost care. Albert fell without a murmur, at once. I swear that his death was instantaneous, as if he had been struck by lightning. What remains is unreal and unimportant. Madden broke in and arrested me. I have been condemned to hang. Abominably, I have yet triumphed. The sacred name of the city to be attacked got through to Berlin. Yesterday it was bombed. I read the news in the same English newspapers which were trying to solve the riddle of the murder of the learned sinologist Stephen Albert by the unknown Ute son. The chief, however, had already solved this mystery. He knew that my problem was to shout, with my feeble voice, above the tumult of war, the name of the city called Albert, and that I had no other course open to me than to kill someone of that name. He does not know, for no one can, of my infinite penitence and sickness of the heart. A malicious and outlandish statement. In point of fact, Captain Richard Madden had been attacked by the Prussian spy Hans Rabiner, alias Victor Runeberg, who drew an automatic pistol when Madden appeared with orders for the spy's arrest. Madden, in self-defense, had inflicted wounds of which the spy later died. Note by the manuscript editor.
Alright. right.